Starr and D'Amico Show brought to you by cheapesttshirts.ca. Men's, women's, children's t-shirts in all sizes. Hoodies too. Aprons, anything for merchandise, cheapesttshirts.ca. Buy today, ship tomorrow. McLean's Pub, 1210 Peel Street, your home away from home for all Montreal Canadiens games and your home for D'Amico and Starr live once a month. Check out their website. Check them out in person, 1210 Peel Street in downtown Montreal. LittleBearOnline.com. Chuck and Evie and they're an amazing staff care about your pet as much as you do. Curbside pickup, local delivery. On St. Catherine across from Westmount Square, LittleBearOnline.com. And by Catherine Prince Realty. Remax Platine certified broker, the best in the business. South Shore, moving to Brossard, moving to Montreal to be closer to the Montreal Canadiens. Check out our website, Catherine with a K, CatherinePrince.ca. Just want a home evaluation? None better than Catherine Prince. There he is, Marco D'Amico on the Starr and D'Amico Show. I am Shaun Starr. Thank you so much for being with us. The road to 20,000 subscribers begins with you guys, and you guys have been off the charts. Happy, proud milestone. We've crossed the 11,000 subscriber mark. Thanks to everybody. We still haven't crossed the mark yet of the Montreal Canadiens locking down a 2C with the news that hit on the weekend that Kirby Dach is day-to-day, Patrick Laine day-to-day. So the Canadiens host the New York Rangers. Without those two guys, I mean, are you surprised a little bit here that here we are on this Wednesday talking about the Montreal Canadiens and the timeline for a 2C?
No. I think there was hope that perhaps Kirby Dach would find his way. And look, honestly, I think his last game before his injury, he was his best in terms of implication, in terms of making hits, in terms of being aggressive, in terms of steals. Unfortunately, that there's an injury that he's still kind of dealing with, whether it's a return to health plan like the Canadiens had with Reinbacher last year, where it was one game on, one game off, or give him a couple of games, give him a break, and come back maybe on Wednesday or in Calgary on Monday or Wednesday, depending on which days they play, right? So you never really know with these kinds of situations, but I think it becomes evident when you look at the Canadiens lineup, what's missing, right? Like, I think on defense, everyone can agree that they're set, and it's a good note to their depth that they can lose a Caden Gooley and then insert Jaden Struble and Arbor Xhekaj and, look passably okay defensively. But it's a different thing right now when you lose a guy like Kirby Dach and the next man up, although I think he played great, Joe Veleno, but just not, that kind of offensive presence that you would hope. So, ultimately, when you look at that, I think it makes things difficult for the wingers because, you have a guy like Zachary Bolduc who was on a pretty effective line with Kirby Dach and Brendan Gallagher until Dach went down, finds himself on a line with Joe Veleno and Owen Beck. Not exactly the same style, not exactly the same opportunity. I think it really speaks to the Canadiens' lack of depth in that issue. From what I've been told, the Canadiens are quite aware of this problem. I think everybody would be shocked if I told them otherwise. Obviously, the market isn't where it's at, but you're already starting to see teams falter out of the gate this season that are starting to have conversations of, well, hey, what are we going to do with this guy or what are we going to do with that guy? And I think from what I'm being told, the Canadiens are very active in trying to keep tabs on all of this right now because I don't think, I think the pipe dream for everybody is that they're going to wait for Sidney Crosby. The Pittsburgh Penguins, continue to win games. They're above 500 right now. So I don't know that the dream of Sidney Crosby is something you can necessarily wait for unless Pittsburgh truly drops off. So the Canadiens have to be realistic in terms of their management opportunities. And in this situation, in terms of opportunity cost and what could be available, there could be some top six centers available that could really put the Canadiens over the top earlier in this season to help better position them in the standings at the end of the year.
I'm glad you brought up 87. I'm glad you brought up Sidney Crosby, who, by the way, has 7 points in 6 games, coming off a 2-point performance with Pittsburgh's 3-0 win Saturday night over San Jose. I find myself so curious about the Penguins for the obvious reason, and seeing 87 and I can't help but reminded what we spoke about, a couple of different times when we hashed out, Crosby's future related to the Penguins, related to any other team. It's like, you tell these guys, they can't do a certain thing. But I wonder about, like, we're talking about a team that's, after Monday night will play 7 games. I still have, that 20-game marker before the Montreal Canadiens really, take a hard look and have some tough decisions and maybe some closed door meetings about filling the void of the 2C. Do you think that it's changed based on the early impressions, whether it's Kirby Dach or anyone else, Alex Newhook moving over, that maybe the sample size needs to be trimmed down a little bit in order to expedite this situation, so to speak?
I don't even think it's the sample size that's going to be the determinant factor, to be honest with you. I think it's the market, right? Like, the Canadiens may decide by the 10-game mark, okay, this isn't going to work, we need to improve.
Yeah.
But like this summer, if there's nobody available, what are you going to do? Right? Like, there's not much to do in this situation. Like, right now, the talk on the trade market is not centers, it's actually excess defensemen. And so you may see a couple of defensemen moved in the next week or two in that regard. Centers, we haven't heard of an available center since Marco Rossi, and no one wanted to pay the price that Bill Guerin and the Minnesota Wild put on him. So with the significant lack of centers available on the market, no one's biting on a 60-point center. That's all you got to know, is there wasn't any bona fide top 6 center that teams really wanted that was made available in that situation. And anybody that thought, even just began to think about making one available, it was like the seagulls and Finding Nemo. Everyone just screaming, mine, 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 mine. So it doesn't make sense in this case for the Canadiens to go into it because there's nothing available. But I think internally the conversation is already being had of like, okay, well, Oliver Kapanen has looked good in a third-line setting. There's nothing wrong with that. Kirby Dach has looked better, but again, not the 2C kind of ability that you would need as a contender. But the fact that, if Kirby Dach can come back, like if this is truly minor and Kirby Dach can come back in a regular pace and continue to play the way that he has, well, he becomes a decent trade chip as well. If he could show that he is healthy, a lot of teams would love a big right shot center. I know the Calgary Flames have been looking for one forever. So it's an interesting dynamic where if you can get these players to moderate health and show that they can play, well, then these are guys that could also be dangled in a chase for a 2C. And I think teams are going to be more apt and more open to those kinds of trades when they decide to throw the towel on the season, which is something we've been talking about since the summer. What makes this episode different? From an analytics perspective, the Canadiens have the weakest C line right now in the Eastern Conference. That includes the Philadelphia Flyers, who I believe have the worst center depth in the NHL. Huh. That's not a good thing. No. That's really not a good thing. And it speaks to how slow of a start the Canadiens have had down the middle. And Nick Suzuki hasn't necessarily been the most noticeable Nick Suzuki. He's still been the effective Nick Suzuki because statistically he's the best center on the team. But the drop-off after him is so incredibly large that you have to keep scrolling to find the next center on the list. That's not a good thing, and that really goes to show, when you play a team like the New York Rangers, you have to win that battle down the middle, and the Canadiens did not win that battle down the middle. In fact, you look at the Panarin goal, Kapanen coming up on the ice, not out of position, Cole Caulfield forced to be the middleman in that play, and he gets beat. The defenseman gets surprised. Panarin's coming down the opposite wing. Boom, goal, right? So, again, that to me speaks to the lack of strength down the middle at 5-on-5. And I think that's definitely what's hurt the Canadiens so far this season in the games that they lost. You look at the Leafs, same concept. They got outclassed by the Leafs' depth at center, and it came back to bite them in certain situations. So I feel it's the same kind of situation here. The Canadiens are aware of it, and the fact that they've been successful despite it speaks to the overall team depth. But I think it pushes, if this team is going to push further than where they were last year, then that's something that needs to be addressed no later, in my opinion, than the trade deadline. But I just don't know if waiting for Sidney Crosby is the way to go. I really don't.
Not yet, anyway. And you can wait all you want. Nothing's happened until 87. Puts his hand up and says, "Okay, you know what? Time for a change. Maybe I can help out the organization's future by getting a boatload of almost ready to go players." But I want to go back to what you brought up about Kirby Dach And to me, it just reemphasizes the point. If this guy was like 3 inches shorter, I don't think there would be too many teams. Like, I'm puzzled, honestly, and I'm going to come across here, I guess, as a Kirby Dach hater for a second, but I just don't see the value. I just don't see the value in terms of.
Well, you don't see the value
looking at it.
You don't see the value in him.
He's hurt regularly, and when he isn't hurt, I don't really see a guy that has top 6 potential, to be quite harsh.
It's not harsh. Honestly, it's not that bad to say that. And it's okay because that's what the Canadiens are trying to determine for one final time. But, with his tools, his size, whatever, if he were put in the right chair, which is a third line center, I think he'd be fine.
Okay.
I think he'd be more than fine, right? But that's the thing. But even as a third line center with his attributes still has good value. And I think that's the key here, is that the Canadiens they have enough depth at for bottom 6 centers. I think that's what they have a really good amount of right now. Florian Jacki, Owen Beck, Jake Evans, Oliver Kapanen. You have Hayden Papanikis coming up too. They have the depth in those roles. What they lack is, top 6 center ability, which is why everyone's focused on Michael Hage, who again had himself a pretty good weekend. I believe 2 goals this weekend. To continue to add to his total. So, Michael Hage is the hope here. And so this is the difference. I just don't think the Canadiens sit on this until the trade deadline. I don't, not from what I can gather. I think they're going to be very aggressive in looking for opportunities like the ones that the Ottawa Senators took advantage of in Buffalo with Dylan Cousins. I think that they're waiting for that kind of an opportunity to become available. It's unfortunate that that Cousins wasn't made available this year, because I feel like this year the Canadiens could have probably made a better offer than what the Ottawa Senators ended up making for Dylan Cousins, because that's exactly the type of 50 to 60 point center that plays physical and shoots, and goes to the net. That's exactly the style that they're looking for. Yeah. So it'll be very interesting to see what kind of players are made available, because the Canadiens have the assets to pounce, and teams are paying attention to their farm team, and teams are paying attention to some of the younger players on their roster. So it's a worthwhile conversation.
Let's end on this point here as we talk about the still ongoing issue of the lack of a bona fide number 2 center to play behind Nick Suzuki. I don't ever think for a second that the Hugo management team is pressured by outside voices, outside opinion.
No.
But what I think they may be pressured by here is there's an opportunity, and that's what everybody looks for, right? Whether it's in pro hockey or in your professional life or personal life, you're looking for an opportunity, and the opportunity has presented itself. The Florida Panthers have played a lot of hockey in back-to-back years, and they're hurt now. The Tampa Bay Lightning struggling out of the gate. These are 2 top teams that everybody was projecting. Montreal Canadiens came storming out of the gate, right, with that loss to Toronto, and then a little bit of a setback Saturday against the New York Rangers. But that's the opportunity. That's where I can see some pressure to maybe emphasize your point about not waiting until the deadline. Like, you don't want the hot start, the good vibes. The national media is talking about, asking the question, are the Canadiens the most exciting team in the league? People are talking about this team, and I don't think this management team wants to waste what has been a pretty good start so far. There's the pressure, right?
I wouldn't even say that's the pressure. It's just, I think you look across the league and you think there's a serious opportunity for this team to finish in the top 3 of the Atlantic Division. Knowing that, why aren't you trying to push for that? But then the flip side becomes, well, why would you want to make such a short-sighted decision, right? Like, why would you spend assets just to make a higher push for the playoffs this year when you know that you're not necessarily at that contention level? And that I also that's why I see both ends. What I will say, and what I think, I think the Canadiens will try to improve their center depth. I don't know if they're going to get a permanent 2C in this case, because I can tell you they have really high in what he could do in the NHL level. But when you look at the next year or two, because I don't think Michael Hage is going to be a plug and play player in a top 6 setting for the Canadiens out of college, even next year for that matter. So, you're going to have to think about it logically and say, well, what do they do for the next 2 to 3 years? Because the answer cannot be hope for someone to rise or hope for Michael Hage to. No, you have to have a legitimate piece in that point. And I understand the Canadiens are still rebuilding, and that's why there's no rush or pressure. But I feel like if they get to the point where they're in end of November, beginning of December, there's centers that are made available. The Canadiens are firing on all cylinders, but are being let down by the lack of depth at center. Then I think it's and the Pittsburgh Penguins are above 500. Then I think at that point, like, you have to make a call, right? The hope of waiting for Sidney Crosby to make a decision and choose Montreal amongst the list of suitors that are going to be there, and boy, will that list be long. I just feel like it's a pipe dream, whereas the reality is you got to move your rebuild along. And if you can get yourself a more established long-term piece, well, then, I think you're better off making that kind of a move in a more immediate action than the 10% chance of being able to land a Crosby in March. I think that's the key here. And that's the way that the Canadiens are going to want to address this, because they're just waiting for teams to fall off. They're waiting for teams to throw up the white flag, and I think at that point, that's when they want to take advantage.
There's Marco D'Amico. Follow him at MN D'Amico. You can follow us all the way to McLean's Pub tonight, 1210 Peel Street. We will be there for our first live show if you're watching this on Wednesday. I really hope you take some time and come out. You won't regret it. We've got lots of prizes to give away ahead of the Montreal Canadiens and Calgary Flames. You can be a part of the show. We've got Montreal Canadiens tickets to give away. Thanks to McLean's for supplying those. And by the way, the first round at that game will be on our friends at McLean's. The generosity never ends on the Starr and D'Amico show. Marco, thanks as always, and we'll see you later tonight live from McLean's, 1210 Peel, live show. And if you're not there, it'll be streaming on the channel as always. Show kicks off at 7 o'clock. We'll see you tonight, Marco.